So I thought that was deliberate. I thought we were playing with our brains.
No, that's
PowerPoint.
the Mac version of this PowerPoint slide was very orderly. If I may just add something, a bit of interpretation. The thought is that you have the researcher in the little purple circle going around deciding through which paradigm to look at the object of research. Broadly, 4 choices: positivist, interpretivist, critical theory, or postmodern. And these tend to be separate one from another. They tend to be quite snooty with regard to the other paradigms. And the point it's trying to make is that you don't get the object of research pure, uncontaminated. You get it via the rules that dictate what counts as true, what counts as knowledge of each of the paradigms.
It's useful. So, questions?
Caroline Ellis for Jane, actually, based on what Jamie's just said, from your interpretivist perspective. Do you then think that you might adopt a little bit of critical, theoretical, critical realism?
I'm quite comfortable with where I've located my research, and I've gone around certainly all the paradigm positions here, other than positivism, being a qualitative researcher, and I did actually sort of flirt with the idea of being locating it in a pragmatist school, locating it in critical theory, but I'm quite comfortable with interpretivism because it really does lend itself to the lived experience, which is really what I'm exploring.
And I was very interested in what you said about the narrative analysis and the stories. I really very much enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline.
We've been learning in our research methods course that we should select the right tool for the job. So I wonder if each of you could give an example of a scenario or situation where your paradigm is the best fit.
Sorry, can you just say the last bit again?
An example of a situation or scenario where your paradigm would be the best fit or the best tool for that job.
I think from a critical point of view, if you're aiming to uncover sort of like the latent power structures or inequality in terms of organisational communications, for example, or it could be recruitment, it could be a wide range of things you could look at. And so from a diversity angle, for example, in terms of whose voice is not heard and what's not happening. Postmodern is an interesting one. You're going to struggle to sell that into organisations to say that you're coming from a point where there's a kind of micro choice as opposed to this kind of big answer. So I say it's more of a case of looking at it in terms of trying to synthesize and to create new knowledge in a way which it takes into account all of the paradigms really, because I think that's part of it. It's not to say that I think overall out of all of the paradigms, it's the more that you can think about how you can compare and contrast positivism with critical, so that actually gives you a better tool. So postmodern ones is a good one for really challenging language use, for example, and how what language and what's we saying signifies in science. There's a lot of kind of post-structural work which goes in postmodern is about what is being left unsaid. So when you see a company's mission statement, that's a very visible statement of what they're trying to achieve. But what's being left unsaid whilst they, what's with outside of that mission statement, what's actually being said in the organisation.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that, say, social constructionism would be the best for any particular topic, but it's how you want to look at something. So what I'm looking at in my PhD is social class. So you could use, and a lot of sociologists use, a sort of quite positivist approach in terms of measuring class. But the problem with that is, in sort of everyday world, that's not necessarily how we talk about class. So they have a very sort of economic, they distinguish between class and status, whereas how we think of class is often by status. So actually, class is quite a socially constructed concept. And I think social construction is very, very broad, but within that, you could look at how people actually use it and what does that actually mean.
Yes, I'm looking at role change over time amongst public sector accountants. So the interpretivist paradigm and the narrative approach is really appropriate for that. Looking at organisational change, looking at role change, how that complexity really, it lends itself to an interpretivist approach. And moreover, because I'm looking at how role change unfolds over time and how people perceive things differently, the subjectivities, how they're impacted by change, it's a very appropriate paradigm to underpin my study.
Having spoken about paradigms from post-positivism, that isn't actually the paradigm I inhabit in my research, so I'm going to struggle to necessarily justify it, but I know that I cite work from a positivist frame, often when I'm framing a research issue, because the notion of counting things and showing sort of statistical differences can be part of the context that makes another research question particularly interesting. So I've done research about age and gender in the workplace, and I would always frame my research using work that comes from multiple different paradigms, and the key thing is to be reflexive and acknowledge that that's what you're doing as part of setting it up. I'd certainly echo what Sam and Mark both say about language. If you're using a sort of social constructionist frame, then paying attention to language. And I think the two categories of concept that most benefit from that approach are new concepts and concepts that are completely old and taken for granted, that need to be kind of sort of destabilized. So taking something like age, you might think that was this totally stable, boring, non-arguable concept of chronological age. But even within positivism, there are different types of age that positivist researchers have gone out and conceptualized and operationalized and measured, things like subjective age or biological age. But I was looking at it much more as a social construction, so paying attention to how the language around it was being used and the categories or subject positions that get created within it. And then the other category is totally new things, like Brexit. What is Brexit? Well, Brexit means Brexit, said our Prime Minister. And she said that for a reason, because it was almost impossible to say what it was. And indeed, it's an ever-evolving construct that's become to dominate British political and social life at this particular point of the 21st century. So I don't doubt for a moment that there are many papers out there already looking at different sort of aspects of Brexit and how it affects different aspects of organisational life. And some of them, I'm sure, will be social constructionist approaches that try to deconstruct exactly what it is. I hope that helps.
I'll pick, if I may, one of the paradigms I'm using and give you an example that shows you how it's great, but also how it's limiting. So if you go into an organisation to investigate empowerment with a suspicious eye, that might be one way of describing a critical theorist approach. You don't take things as read. You try and unpack everything you see and hear in order to discover the truth that have been hidden. So empowerment, you might reasonably suspect that it's a management platitude, and that it's another case of managers overpromising and under-delivering. And that's legitimate, because I'm sure that's happening. But if you're trying to investigate paradoxes where you are trying to see both sides of the coin, you are at risk of ignoring managers genuinely trying to distribute power. In any case, I mean, one of the paradoxes of becoming more senior in an organization is that your influence depends more and more on other people, because you have to delegate. So my feeling is better to find out how to do that well, rather than just take rather than only take pot shots at the people doing it poorly.
Yes, a question specifically for Jane, actually. The interpretivist paradigm, which I have trouble with,
It is hard.
but I'm thinking of using. And I'm
Yeah.
interested in what you do in a practical sense, because as presumably you don't want any preconceptions when you begin to do your analysis. However, what was your literature review? Did you take papers from other paradigms in building your background literature review?
For sure, actually. I mean, it's interesting. I was just reflecting on something Jamie said, that there's certainly positivist, there's narrative papers that use a positivist approach, which actually sort of count how many times phrases come up from partial parts of narrative. So yes, I have drawn on other paradigms.
So you build a sort of case and then you decide to investigate.
But it's about where
it.
you position yourself and being clear about what your perspective is. So if you're citing other papers, you may be drawing, as Rebecca said, from various different sources, and they may not fit with your paradigm. They may be saying different things to that you're saying.
It's just important to acknowledge that
Yeah.
in the literature review, that you're drawing from different paradigms. And it helps make the case for whatever lens you have decided to apply in your own research. There's a fantastic slide coming up in Adrian's talk later on, so I won't preempt it, but it's a very good example of that in action. Any other questions?
I'm very interested in your lovely little diagram there, Jamie, and I noticed that your researcher is circling around the outside and not necessarily, we're not recognising in that the influence of the researcher in the research process. And I'm just wondering if each of you could comment from the point of view of your chosen paradigm, if you like, what the main challenges to you as a researcher are in adopting that particular paradigm.
For me, it's that sense of the subjective and sort of dissenting myself from the process. And even when I'm reading papers or journals, or and thinking about, okay, well, what does this mean from a research point of view, just from my own point of view, and to constantly keep thinking about the assumptions that I'm making, the challenges to what I've I think one of the risks, if you sort of go down the critical postmodern, as Jamie alluded to, is that you run the risk of becoming that becomes the truth. So you're negating what those actually set out, those paradigms are setting out to do, and therefore you take that as being universal truth. So as Jamie said, everyone is somehow in the wrong, or so there's no real good stuff out there. Hence what I mentioned about the nihilistic attitude. So smile a lot. Otherwise you do tend to think, well, actually, is the world just gone to, and what am I going to do about it? So, for me, that's one of the key, from a research point of view, is actually to remind myself that this is a lens that I'm looking through. I use Lacan as well, so it's that kind of sense of using that and understanding and reflecting and realising that, rather than just thinking, therefore, I am.
That's quite a good question. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I think it's probably partly twofold. One is with any, I think, qualitative research is the process of analysis and interpretation, and feeling whether you've got it right, because it is your interpretation. And I think the other thing is, I'm doing focus groups and interviews with people, and they're very interested in talking to me about this particular subject. And I feel a little bit of I don't know, because I'm not necessarily taking on board what they say as it is. I'm then going to take it a step further and interpret it. So I just feel a bit, it's not an ethical dilemma, but it just feels a little bit like, am I doing justice to the participants and what they're telling me? Does that make sense? Yeah.
For me, the key word is reflexivity. It's really thinking about, what is my role in this process, and my stance is that the data is co-created between us, and so we are, if you like, in a dance together to create that, create the data. And I'm quite comfortable with that, but it's that recognition that you're not standing outside that you're actually inside the process, and you're co-creating that data with your participants. So for me, that feels quite comfortable, not so much of a challenge.
I think using discourse analysis and using it with often, for me, data that I've obtained from the web, it's about the parameters that I draw around the edges of my data in terms of what I'm going to include and what I'm going to exclude. And some of the ethical challenges around collecting internet data, I think, in particular the fact that the internet is not a unitary single location. There are many places on the internet, and some places which are ostensibly public, which I think is probably better described as accessible, are nevertheless seen by those who use them as quite private spaces. So for me, I think, as a lot of the work I've done has used internet data, which I'm then going to apply a discourse analysis lens using a social constructionist paradigm, has been about the ethics of what the participant may or may not have intended as public or private. And I think that is only going to increase and has been brought into very sharp focus around the Cambridge Analytica episode, which is quite an extreme case. I think for the sort of data collection I've done, it's a much more kind of contained and moderate situation, but nevertheless, that big challenge is out there.
The researcher bubble and the arrow suggests that she pirouettes around, going, I wonder which paradigm I'll use today. It describes an ideal where you would take a relatively neutral approach, or at least be lucid about the pros and cons of every paradigm. In truth, I think we have paradigms we warm to naturally. I suggest that Jeremy Corbyn is not naturally an interpretivist, or a postmodernist for that matter. And so, to give you an example of the thing I'm looking at, organisations I submit have a hope that they can create order and impose it upon the world, and I have a suspicion that in doing so they ignore the world that continues to move under their feet. I need to be quite careful that my theme I'm warming to, that the world is unpredictable, doesn't become, the new sort of orthodoxy that I then defend. So just need to be aware that any conclusions one comes to are temporary, contingent, etc.
I'm afraid I think we've reached the point where we have to stop, but we will be available in the coffee break and in the bar afterwards, I think. So thank you very much indeed.